What's the most unexpected thing you've learned through a DNA ancestry test? My super racist mom's side of the family has black ancestry. They call it the family taint. The same side of the family claims Native American ancestry. DNA shows zero of that. However, I was able to find some family lore via an ancestry site. In 1840 or so, this guy Charles shows up in a Texas town with his son. Charles has no other family and offers no backstory. He claims to be part Indian. That son becomes one of my great-great-grandfathers. I'm guessing they were in fact part black and claimed Indian ancestry due to being escaped slaves or to avoid racism. My family is Belgian, but in photos from the late 1800s early 1900s several of my ancestors on my maternal side looked a lot like South American Indians. We would joke that maybe we were descended from Aztecs who had been taken to Europe by the Spanish and somehow wound up having kids in the Spanish-occupied Netherlands. DNA has proven it completely false. My ancestors for the past 400 years are demonstrably all from a small area within Belgium and in no way Amerindian. In fact, my DNA was used as a reference point for Belgian ancestry by DNA companies. Family story was that my great-grandfather came to the US from Barbados and his family was British, but there might have been some mixing with people on the island. I was excited to see what native Caribbean people tribes would show up. I was interested in doing research on the subject. It was mid-2020, not much else going on at the time. Turns out his family came to Barbados from Nigeria by way of the Caribbean slave trade. Still want to research, just much more difficult to find records that would exist for plantations on the island. That my late grandfather, on my dad's side, was not in fact, a glass blower, but an office clerk. An office clerk who worked for Western Electric in Chicago. For Western Electric in Chicago right at the time when a bunch of people got investigated for embezzlement. Then he suddenly died when my dad was very young. Then we find this guy in Florida who has the exact same name, just the middle name is different. Who look a lot like my dad? Who is the same age as my grandpa would be? Who had an entire family? We found his obituary that the percentage of Inuit DNA isn't common enough in the databases to read properly, and that it will often show up as Central and South American ancestry in the results. I can't remember the scientific explanation, but the above mentioned is part of the explanation as far as I remember. Apart from that, the tiny percentage of Scandinavian and European in my Inuit DNA tracks with my family history of a few sailors, whalers and grocers thrown into the mix, so that wasn't a surprise to me. I was a surprise DNA baby as in my mom had a one-night stand on a desk at work and I was the product of her cheating. Turns out, I'm 50 finished and 25 years younger. I'm 36 and the youngest of my 4 older siblings who are all grandparents, haha. I've gotten to meet them and my 86-year-old bio father and I have a great relationship with my dad and bio dad. My mom is a hoe and have been in sea with her for 18 years. I figured out who my dad was. Birth mom never told anyone, never put his name on a document. Cece Moore used to have a Facebook page and helped amateurs with genetic genealogy. So I found my dad in the same way the Golden State Killer was discovered. Unfortunately, he had passed away. His family tested our shared closest living relative to confirm the DNA match. The family story was that my great-great-grandfather lived and worked in China for a bit. The reality is that he was 100% Chinese, immigrated to Australia, was jailed for theft but only because they couldn't actually prove he killed the person the goods were stolen from, and then they really did murder his wife after he was released. According to my DNA test, I recently discovered that I have an ancestral lineage directly linked to a small, obscure island off the coast of Antarctica, where my ancestors apparently thrived as expert ice sculptors and ran a secret society dedicated to perfecting the art of penguin communication through interpretive dance. That I'm half Italian after being told both sides and seeing genealogy records stating that we were English American mutts. English, Irish, Scottish, German and French. The DNA test proved all that and that I'm 48 Italian. It would explain why my paternal GMA treated me poorly and so much more. We thought my father's side of the family was Hungarian. Turns out that while my grandfather did immigrate from Hungary to the USA as a child, he was of mostly Irish descent. My family were likely potato famine refugees, and made it to America via a couple of generations in Hungary. My mother and other family members swore up and down we have some Native American roots. Both 23andMe and determined that was a lie. To be fair, I'm not surprised. Claiming Native American ancestry seems to be a trendy, old white people thing. Well, let me tell you, the most unexpected thing I learned from my DNA ancestry test is that apparently, I'm too unicorn, can you believe that? It turns out there's a hidden lineage of mythical creatures in my family tree. Now I just need to figure out where to. I've learned just how broken my family tree really is, with multiple generations of mistaken fathers. Both my mother and father carried last names from men who were not their true fathers. It makes it very difficult to build a traditional family tree. Found out I have a half-brother. My dad had no idea he had a son. Man that raised him had no idea he wasn't his biological father. Since that happened 2 years ago, it has happened to 2 other men in my family. Who knew sex could make babies? Lol. My brother had been looking for his dad his entire 30 years of life. My mom only knew his dad's first name. My brother got a match to a brother on 23andMe and messaged him. Now my brother has a great relationship with his dad's side. Not DNA, but in researching on, I learned my grandfather had a wife before my grandmother. His first wife committed suicide and took their 2 dogs with her while he was serving as a doctor on a medical ship in World War II. Not through DNA testing, but when my mother got into tracing our ancestors, she discovered that she is descended from a lady named Elizabeth Cromwell, the daughter of Oliver Cromwell, who is a little bit famous in England. I have colonial ancestry, which astonished me completely because I am a second-generation American. I had previously thought my grandmother was joking when she said our family came here, didn't like it and went back home. My grandfather had 3 ex-wives before he met my grandmother. Apparently, back in the day you could just marry a woman, spend 3 months together and just leave and no one would say or do anything about it. Half of my ancestry was supposedly 100 Greek, but there were speculations we were part Turkish. It turns out we are part Arab from the Levant instead of Turkish, despite ancestors living in Turkey. There's Italian and Irish heritage in my family. I thought I was the one white American who somehow was neither, also some North African heritage, but that could be the Italian Sardinian influence. That I have a cool 30 half-siblings, thanks to unregulated sperm donation. And that's just 30 that have taken the test. Also fun fact, ADHD seems awfully genetic from where I'm sitting. My entire life, I've been told that my paternal great-grandfather was 100 Native American and my maternal grandmother was 100 German ancestry. According to my DNA, neither can be true. My grandmother didn't have 2 children she put up for adoption. There were 4 of them and 2 weren't ever spoke of in her lifetime. Also, my uncle was not my mother's full brother. Apparently I'm 99.7 British Isles. I knew I was British but not that British. The .3 was African, so I think during the slave trade someone got freaky with an African dude. That my mother's Scottish ancestors came to the USA 250 years ago and never intermarried with other nationalities. They have only ever married other 100 Scottish people. When my wife told her mother she was taking a 23andMe test, her mother said, "I guess you'll find out who your real father is now," and laughed. She wasn't joking. I'm a diverse byproduct of the slave trade. Nigerian, Native American, and Spanish. A lot of people own slaves, not just white. And they was fucking. My grandma has another half-sibling. Her dad was an bar owner and her mom was a saint who raised the first known affair baby as her own. A child my uncle fathered as a teenager. He had no idea. The child is in her 60s and he is 85. It was definitely a shock to both of them. I have been trying to reach out to a second cousin who shouldn't exist but whose surnames make sense but would imply some hanky-panky. Went on. I'm white and learned I'm also too Native American. It wasn't too surprising since I have ancestors from New England during the 1700s. I knew I have German ancestry, but it says my DNA is half German. The tiny bits of Scandinavian and Basque were surprising too. That I am not, in fact, an only child. That the name on the birth certificate is not, in fact, that of my father. Typical stuff. My super sex shamey abstinence only late mother had a daughter she gave up for adoption at 19, 5 years before she met my dad. Upside down face. I knew I was mostly British and German, but turns out there's also Danish and a sliver each of Scottish and Irish in there. I have a black ancestor, originally from Senegal, probably 220-ish years ago. Most likely a man, on my father's side. My dad was adopted and found out his bio-grandfather worked at the same place I do, which was kinda cool to learn. That way back in the 1600s we were French nobility. I already knew we were related to Henry VIII mother. That the government can use my data to arrest my family members if their DNA is found near a crime scene. I learned my personal DNA data was not secure and is now available to the government in the dark web. My uncle had a kid that no one knew about before he met my aunt. I met my new cousin 2 weeks ago. Nazi blood. Lots and lots of Nazi blood running through my veins. My uncle really died in The Hague. I'm adopted. One of my mom's friends that used to babysit me ended up being a fourth cousin of mine. While I always knew I wasn't completely pure, I'm far less pure than I actually presumed. I found out I have English royalty in me serving Henry VIII. Where's my piece of that pie? I have a very Italian last name, but upon DNA testing I'm in fact 100 English. Crazy! I have Jewish ancestry, I never suspected that one. Even more mixed race than I thought. My friend who would bring up his Italian ancestry is only about 1 Italian genetically. That DNA is being used to attempt to make clones of me without my consent. So great! I learned that my father on my birth certificate was not my biological father. That they sell our data to the government, and the pharmaceutical industry. That my mom's dad wasn't her dad and was a Jewish guy, so I'm 25% Jewish. My husband's cousin murdered his son wife. The boy under the billboard, 33 British. I'm black. Somebody had jungle fever on the plantation, winking face, that I'm part French. No wonder I'm Arajan and like cheese so much. That I have 5 half-siblings through my dad. He really got around. That I am the only full-blood grandchild out of the 4 of us.